Thank you, Penny, and welcome everyone. Mac, you're going to be our sole male holdout today, so thank you for representing. Nancy and I are delighted to help celebrate Women's History Month by bringing you stories and secrets of the Gilded Age, the Grand Dames. And Sandra, Nancy's picture has disappeared from the upper corner. Could you bring her back for me? I don't know if she heard me or not.
Well,
I did.
There she
I'm not
is.
sure.
There we are. We've got Nancy back in the
Okay.
room now. Welcome. Come in and have a seat. So my partner, Nancy Markey, as always, is coming to us from and lives and works in the Newport, Rhode Island area, which is an area synonymous with the Gilded Age, as we have said before. Our presentation today is going to take a little over about an hour and 10 minutes, so we should have plenty of time at the end for discussion. If you have questions, just stop and ask us, and we're happy to entertain them. So without further ado, and I'll wait for our last two attendees to come get seated. I'm sorry. No, you're fine, Penny. You're fine. Thank you so much for your help. There we go. So without further ado, Nancy, why don't you take it away for us?
thanks, Kay. I'm trying to look into the little window. Humor me for a minute. How many of you have been heard one of our presentations before?
Oh, almost everyone.
Oh, good. Okay. So then the second question I always ask is, how many of you are watching HBO's Gilded Age?
And again, we have a majority of hands risen.
Okay. So Kay and I are always asked if we watch the HBO Gilded Age, and we don't. And the reason that I look forward to the day when I can watch it. But the reason that we don't is it's fiction. There is some truth in some of the storylines, have some truth in there, but Kay and I never want to be in the position where we're giving you information that's not accurate, that's been fictionalized or Hollywood version. So everything that we tell you, we have personally researched. And so if it conflicts with something you're seeing on TV, we'd love to hear that. And I know there are some things that maybe are a little different, but what we're going to talk about today as far as the Grand Dames is everything, like I said, we have vetted and we have researched. So we always start our classes by reminding everyone what the Gilded Age was. And the thumbnail description was an era of rapid economic growth and industrialization that's characterized by political corruption and vast social inequality. So the period of the Gilded Age that we're going to talk about is the 1870s is the early Gilded Age. And then we say 1910, but maybe the Gilded Age carried over for a couple more years. But what's important to remember about the Gilded Age is that this rapid industrialization created this vast wealth, primarily from the railroads. And so that's where you're going to have this vast social inequality. So before the Gilded Age, of course, there was wealth. There was always haves and have-nots. But where did it come from? And you might recognize this slide from earlier presentation. And it's just reminding you where the old money came from. And a lot of it came from land with the plantation owners or the tobacco farmers, which were the lower lords. The cults made their fortune on weapons. Of course, there were merchants and slave traders that became very wealthy. The fur traders were pretty much the Astors, which we're going to talk about today. They traded in beaver pelts. And then, although we all know that Commodore Vanderbilt became uber rich, it was primarily from the railroads that he became uber rich, but his original fortune came from shipping. And then probably the most unpopular way to get wealth in America at that time was war profiteering. So during the Civil War, certain people profited from basically the misery of others and became very wealthy. So old money, just to remind you, old money is supposedly money that's been passed down at least 3 generations. And the reason it's 3 generations is the belief is The first generation makes the money, and it's the third generation that depletes it and spends it. So it has to make it to the third generation. Now, in the beginning of the Gilded Age, there were two women who dominated society, and both of those women coincidentally were named Caroline. And Kay's going to tell us about the first Caroline.
So Caroline Slidell Perry that you see here was born in 1829, and she is a Newport resident and was considered to be a delicate beauty of the age. And her family referred to her with the affectionate nickname of Tiny. So Caroline was the daughter of Matthew Perry, Commodore Matthew Perry, and that's the gentleman you see in the center there. He gains his fame for being the father of the United States Steam Navy, and he is the first individual to travel to Japan and is famous for opening trade with them in 1854. Her uncle, his brother, the person you see on the right, which coincidentally, this portrait has hung at Crystal Bridges in many exhibits, so you might recognize it. It's Oliver Hazard Perry, and he was a hero in the War of 1812 and is famous for the quote, "We have met the enemy and they are ours." So while the Perrys were not an uber wealthy family, they were well-to-do, but they were very prestigious and elite members of society whose they could trace their ancestry back to the first settlers of Rhode Island. So in 1849, Caroline will marry a gentleman by the name of August Belmont, who was 16 years her senior. Now, Belmont was born with the name Aaron Schonberg, and Schonberg in German means beautiful hills. So he is a German Jewish man who comes to America, and he comes over with the Rothschild Company in finance. His family had always called him August, but when he comes to America, he changes his last name to Belmont, which means beautiful mountain. So he went from beautiful hills to beautiful mountain. Now, rumor has it that August overheard a man making a derogatory, maybe inappropriate comment to the young Caroline when she was only 17 years old. And he gallantly challenged that man to a duel. So in the duel, Belmont is shot in the thigh, but he lives. And he will have a limp for the rest of his life as a result. But he succeeded in causing Caroline to fall madly and deeply in love with him. So they're married in an Episcopalian ceremony, at which time he disavows his Jewish ancestry for the remainder of the time that he lives in America. Now, for those of you who are familiar with Edith Wharton's book, Age of Innocence, her character, Julius Beaufort, is said to be modeled after Belmont. So the Belmonts are going to have 6 children together. They're going to have 4 boys and 2 girls. And in the pre-Gilded Age years, Caroline is the one who is going to dominate society. She's the undisputed leader in Newport and New York both. But in 1875, the very early ages of the Gilded years, her 19-year-old daughter, Jenny, is going to die. And so she's going to willingly withdraw from society in her leadership role, and she goes into mourning for several years. In 1887, her son Raymond will die from an accidental self-inflicted gunshot wound. And once again, she'll withdraw herself back out of society. So you can see her influence was really all pre and very early Gilded Age years. That being said, her remaining 4 children, her daughter Frederica, and her 3 sons, Perry, August Jr., and Oliver Hazard, and their spouses are going to play very pivotal roles in society later on in the Gilded Age. Now, here's a picture of the Belmont homes as they existed, both on the left there on 5th Avenue in New York, and on the right, that was their Newport cottage or mansion, as we'll call it. And that was a place called By the Sea. And that house will actually remain standing in Newport until 1946, when it is eventually demolished to add more gardens to the neighboring Rosecliff estate, which Nancy's going to tell you about earlier or later. Now, most of us will associate the Belmont name with thoroughbred horse racing. After all, the Belmont is the oldest race in the Triple Crown. Well, August and Caroline were, obviously, these were horse people in addition to his financial interests. They actually, to highlight the fact that they were the horse people that they were, they would put riders on their horses to pull their carriage, and their carriage would be driverless. As opposed to what you would see with a wealthy carriage on the left, you see a driver with the whip on the front. They would always have their passengers behind, and the horses did not have riders. So to highlight their equestrian interest, we thought that was really kind of cool trivia. So we wanted to include it. So Nancy, tell us about the next Caroline.
So this one might be more familiar to you, especially if you're watching the Gilded Age HBO. This is Caroline Schumerhorn Astor. And Caroline Schumerhorn was really born to be a snob. Her Schumerhorn Dutch ancestors immigrated to New Amsterdam before it was known as New York City. And so she's one of the Knickerbocker crowd. So by the way, if you ever wonder where the New York Knicks basketball team comes from, that's the Knickerbockers, right? And her lineage will make her a societal star, but her marriage to an Astor is going to make her a superstar. So she marries into the Astor dynasty. And the Astor dynasty starts with a man by the name of John Jacob Astor. And this is his beautiful wife, Sarah Cox Todd Astor. And he's the person that we talked about that was the fur trader. And he would start out with beaver pelts. So it's kind of hard to take a fortune and make it out of beaver pelts, but he was very wealthy. And he would take that money that he got from trapping, and he would start to buy real estate in what is today Manhattan. And in 1918, because the Astros would buy real estate, but they wouldn't sell it. And so it would continue to accumulate. And the way they made their money from the second and third generations is by collecting rents. So they had landlords, or they would lease the property, or they would build apartments or tenements, and they would collect the rents. So that is how the Astor's liquidity came about. They'd sit on their land. But in 1918, when there's a dispute over one of the Astor wills, one of the minor heirs is able to force a sale of the Manhattan properties. And so it's not until then that people realize how much of Manhattan the Astors originally owned. And at that time, they sold over 150 pieces of property.
Hello, good.
Just in Manhattan. This is John Jacob Astor, the first son, and he went by the name William. I'm going to call him William Sr., and this is his wife, Margaret. Now, they have two sons. Actually, they have three sons. The first son, I'm not going to talk about. He was the youngest son. His name was Henry, but if you want to research him, he's got a fascinating story where he marries the gardener's daughter. So, of course, what happens to him? He gets shunned, he gets disinherited, and so he takes his wife, the gardener's daughter, and he moves to upstate New York, and they are never seen in New York or Newport society ever again. So that leaves just the two other brothers, John Jacob, so John the Third, and he marries a woman by the name of Charlotte. Now, John Jacob, as the oldest son, he is the head of the family. So the Astros believe very strongly in this primogenitor idea that the head of the family is going to pass through the oldest son, kind of like Charles III. The kings are going to come through him, not through his brother, even though his brother is probably, the same, more of a peer as his. And so he's going to have one son. He and Charlotte are going to have one son, and his name is William Waldorf. Okay, so there's going to be a lot of Williams. So I'm going to refer to this gentleman as Waldorf Astor, and he's going to marry a woman by the name of Mary. Now, the other brother is also named William. His name is William Backhouse Astor, the junior. So you have the oldest brother, who's John Jacob III, and then you have the younger brother, who is William Astor Jr. And then you have a younger son, Waldorf. And that's going to be important because of what's going to happen in the Astor family. And so when Carolyn marries William, even though the brother is older, she's going to make a bold move. So you have to understand that in 19th century America, the women took their identity from their husbands. So the custom was to refer to the wives using the husband's name, except for the oldest son. So John Jacob, he would be known as Mr. Astor, and his wife would be known, Charlotte would be known as Mrs. Astor. But Caroline here is going to be known as Mrs. William, And Waldorf's wife, Mary, is going to be known as Mrs. Waldorf. So the women didn't have their own identities except through their sons. So as long as Charlotte is alive, she owns the title Mrs. Astor. But for some reason in 1880, Charlotte steps back from society. We don't know why. And so now Caroline decides she's going to claim the name Mrs. Astor. And the way she does this is through calling cards. So these are examples of calling cards, and calling cards were really important rituals of society women when they were calling on other society women. And they were very powerful things. It was the way the society matrons communicated with each other and socialized. Now, there were very strict rules about calling cards. So someone that was new to society, maybe they just married into it or they just moved to New York City, she couldn't go and leave Mrs. Astor a calling card. Mrs. Astor had to be the one that would initiate that relationship. So in these calling cards, certain messages were also delivered by the use of a calling card. So the way it would work is that you would normally send your calling card by your servant to drop off at one of your peers, letting them know that you wanted to go for a visit. If you wanted to visit a person, if you wanted to drop off the calling card in person, then you would take the calling card and you would turn down the upper right-hand corner when it's delivered. If you were visiting for a congratulatory reason, you would turn down the left-hand corner. If you were there for condolences, you would turn down the left-hand corner. If you were going on a trip, you would turn down the right hand, the upper right hand, I'm sorry, the right hand lower corner. So this card, just by turning down the certain corners, communicated information to the recipient. So you would go and you would drop your card off, and then you would go home, and then you would wait a day or two until you received a card in return. And usually it would have a little note on the back. And the card on the lower right with the black band, that message is that we are in mourning. And so if you didn't get a return card, or worse, if you got your card returned in a sealed envelope, that meant you were being rejected by society. And so what Carolyn does is she has calling cards printed up that say Mrs. Astor. Now, Caroline or Charlotte is still alive. So as long as Charlotte's alive, technically she owns that name, Mrs. Astor, but she's withdrawn from society. So Caroline decides that she's going to become the Mrs. Astor, and she has these calling cards printed up and distributed. But then when Charlotte dies, Waldorf's wife, Mary, she also has calling cards printed up as Mrs. Astor. And again, because of primogeniture, remember, Waldorf's wife now has the greater right to be called Mrs. Astor. So what happens is you have two different Astor women that have these Mrs. Astor cards that are circulating in society, and it's causing quite a bit of upheaval because you don't know who you got the card from. Or if you got a card from one Mrs. Astor, you don't want to accept it because you might upset the other Mrs. Astor. So this period of angst, if you will, carried on for a while. And then, of course, it came to a head, like everything does, in Newport. And so they were both in their Newport summer homes, and they went to the post office at different times. And they told the postmaster, if any mail comes for Mrs. Astor, that's my mail. And so the postmaster, who's in the middle of it, he begs them, ladies, can you please just resolve this? I don't know who the real Mrs. Astor, I don't know who that is. And so what he ends up doing is whoever comes to the post office and asks for Mrs. Astor's mail gets Mrs. Astor's mail. So Caroline starts winning this battle just because she is collecting more mail. She's using her calling card more. And I don't know how upsetting it is to Mary, but to her husband, Waldorf, this is the biggest insult that he has ever had to deal with in society. And it's so upsetting to him that he takes his family and he moves to England. And he will start the English branch of the Astor family. So Caroline wins this battle, and she now is going to use the name Mrs. Astor without challenge. So she has the name Mrs. Astor, but now she needs some guidance to make sure that she, as Mrs. Astor, is going to have the most current trends in wines and bands and gowns and entertainment. So enter a man by the name of Ward McAllister. Now, I know if you're watching the HBO series that you've been introduced to Ward McAllister because Nathan Lane is playing Ward McAllister. And I'm sure Nathan Lane is taking a lot of privilege in his portrayal of Mr. McAllister. But Mr. McAllister was from Georgia originally. And before the Civil War, he would spend a lot of time in Newport entertaining. And he was actually known for giving picnics. He owned a farm in Newport. He wasn't an extremely wealthy man. He didn't have a mansion, but he had a farm. And then during the Civil War, or as he called it, the time of trouble, he went to Europe and he spends about 2 years in Europe, visiting various royal courts and aristocratic homes. And he starts to learn the European culture and etiquette. So then when the war is over and he comes back to New York, back to America, he goes to New York City and he starts kind of spreading his knowledge around. Because remember, in Gilded Age, this is what the society women want. They want to replicate whatever they're doing in Europe. They want to do it here in America. So he becomes very popular in New York. But again, he doesn't have any money. He doesn't have any wealth. His wife has enough money for them to live on. So he comes up with this really clever idea that he's going to, use other people's money. And so he convinces 25 patriarch men, 25 men that are of solid merit and birth, a lot of the Knickerbockers. In fact, William N. Waldorf and John Astor are all three of them, one of these patriarch men. And they give Ward $150 each. And now he's going to put on a ball. So in exchange for the $150, each one of those men, there's, like I said, there's 25 of them, they're going to get 9 invitations. And I don't know why, but they get 5 men and 4 women. And then they will tell Ward McAllister who their 9 people are. And then it's Ward's job to go in and make sure there's no duplicates, that only people of good standing are on the list. Like, for example, if somebody tried to sneak in an actress, they would be taken off of the list. And so he's running these balls, and they're so popular that he eventually increases the number of patriarchs from 25 to 50. And they're held at Delmonico's restaurant in New York City. They have a very large room. And so he uses it as a ballroom. So about this time, there's 3 balls during the season, December, January, February. And there's about 450 people that go to these balls, and they're very popular, and it's very prestigious to be there because, again, remember, this list has been scrutinized by Mr. McAllister. Now, he starts it in 1872. Coincidentally, in 1872, Caroline Astor is giving a ball, a debutante ball for her oldest daughter. And so she meets Ward McAllister at these patriarch balls because, again, remember, her husband is a contributor. And she gets to know him. I think she's also distantly related to him, but she gets to know him and she begins to rely on his advice and counsel. And so out of this, the 2 of them come up with this idea. Remember, their goal is to keep society in bounds, to keep it decorous, elegant, and most of all, select. And so Ward McAllister is going to come up with this term, the 400. And the 400, we even hear, that's familiar to us today, probably, the 400. So there's a lot of dispute as to how the term became popular. There's no dispute that Ward McAllister is the one that came up with it. One of the, like kind of a urban legend, if you will, is that the number 400 was the number of people that could fit in Miss Astor's ballroom. And that's actually not accurate. What it looks like, the way that this term seems to have come about was kind of organically, where, remember, Ward McAllister, he loved to talk to the press. He even had a room that he had hours where the press would come and he would, spill the dirt on what's going on in society. And so a reporter is talking to him about, the reporter says, is it true that there are only 125 people that belong in the upper crust of society? And Ward says, no, that there's more than 125 people. And so the reporter says, well, how many people? And again, this is off the cuff kind of conversation. And Ward says, he's thinking about his own patriarch ball. And he says, well, I suppose as many as the ballroom at Delmonico's will hold. And then reporter says, well, how many is that? And so he looks at his wife and he says, I don't know, what do you think? And his wife says, 400. And then Ward says, if you go outside that number, you'll strike those who are either not at ease in a ballroom or else make other people not at ease. So there is some truth that the number is tied to a ballroom, but it doesn't mean that if you don't go to a ballroom, you don't deserve to be in that number. Now, interestingly, there's a quote down there at the bottom from Theodore Roosevelt where he is mocking this idea of 400, and he calls it as flat as stale champagne. Now, ironically, Theodore Roosevelt's oldest daughter, Alice, is in the 400. So this number goes on for many years. And of course, you can imagine people are asking, who's in that 400? Are you in that 400? Are you in that 400? And finally, in 1892, so it's like 3 years after Ward McAllister comes up with this idea of the select 400, the reporters are hounding him to name them. So he finally says, okay, I'll give you a list. So he and Mrs. Astor come up with a list of the 400, and the reporter publishes it in the paper. Now, the list they published, it's not 400. It turns out to be 319. It's only 169 families. And as you can imagine, they've left out a lot of people. So there's a lot of inaccuracy. Names were misspelled, spouses were missing, dead people were included in the list. And the problem is Ward McAllister made a big misstep by putting these names out here. Because of course, if you thought you should be in the 400 and your name isn't there, now you're mad at Ward McAllister, especially if you're a spouse of someone that was named. So this is the beginning of the end of Ward McAllister. But he's still in the hunt when there's this fight about the opera. And I know this is also something that HBO addresses, and there was an opera fight. And that's because before 1880, New York favorite opera place was called the Academy of Music. And it was a small venue, and there were only 18 boxes. And what difference does that make? Well, the boxes are where the elite sat. So maybe they liked opera, maybe they didn't, I don't know. But they liked going to opera in their finest gowns with their, finest jewels and sitting in the boxes on display. And so Commodore Vanderbilt's grandson, William Vanderbilt, he and his wife decide, now they're third generation and they're spending the money and they want to be seen. And so they go to the person that's running in charge of the Academy of Music, who happens to be Perry Belmont. Remember, Perry Belmont is a son of Caroline Belmont. So again, you're going to see the Belmont name is very prominent in Gilded Age society. So William Vanderbilt goes to Perry and says, I want a box. My wife and I want a box in the Academy of Music, and we'll give you $30,000, which was an exorbitant amount of money. And it is today too, but at that time it was an exorbitant amount of money to offer for a box. And Perry basically says to the effect, there's not enough money in the world for me to give the Vanderbilts a box in my Academy of Music. And so Willie then says, well, okay, well, I'm going to get my friends, because this is new money, right? The goal is to keep the new money out of society. It's only the old money that needs to be in society. I'm going to get my new money friends together, and we're going to build, a better mousetrap. We're going to build our own opera. And so out of that, they build the Metropolitan Opera, and they create 122 boxes. There are 3 levels of boxes. They called it the Golden Horseshoe. And that's where the elite of society are going to go to be seen, right? You can be seen by the people on the floor, and you can also be seen by your peers. Now, the Astors and the Perrys, they're in this awkward position because Perry Belmont all of a sudden realizes he might have messed up. So he goes back to Vanderbilt while they're building the Metropolitan Opera. And he says, you know what? I've changed my mind. I'll sell you a box. And Vanderbilt's like, I don't need your box. So Astor and Belmont's, they actually buy boxes in both houses. And so I don't know if you've gotten this far in the Gilded Age, but by 1886, the Academy of Music is no longer producing operas. It turns into like a vaudeville theater. So the new money clearly wins this fight. Now here's 2 of Caroline Astor's homes. On the right, the small square, the rectangular home, that's her original home, and that's the home that when you hear people say that the 400 comes from the number of people that will fit in the ballroom, it's this home they're talking about. It's a very plain on the outside, but I guarantee you on the inside it's not plain. Right next to it is a hotel. That is the Waldorf Hotel. And the last thing that Caroline's nephew, Waldorf, and his wife, Mary, did before they left the country was tear down their family mansion that was next door to Caroline's and built this giant hotel just to annoy his aunt, which it did. And then she ends up building this house to the left on Fifth Avenue. And this is a double house. So she lives in the front of the house, and her son, John Jacob Astor, the fourth, who is ultimately going to perish in the Titanic, lives on the back side of the house. And so when they have the balls, there's a partition between the two homes, and they open it, and they can have over 1,200 people in their combined ballroom. And so the thing that Caroline Astor is the most well known for, because remember, she likes old money, old events, state events. She likes really sedate, decorous things. So she's going to have these large balls. And the ball is always held on the second Monday in January at 10 o'clock. And starts out with inviting 400 people. By as it continues to grow, over 1,200 people will receive invitations to her ball. Now, if you did not get an invitation to Mrs. Astor's ball, you were going to take the next boat to Europe. So you could say you were out of town, or you were going to promptly check yourself at a hospital or get some type of medical condition that was, you had to have a reason why you weren't at the ball. And so this ball is is like the hallmark of the winter season in New York. And this picture here is a giant portrait.
Sorry, I'm on a Zoom class. You can move that. You can move all the furniture if you want.
I just want to let you know that it's fixed, but don't step on them
Okay,
anytime.
okay.
You can wait about 24 hours before you put any kind of pressure on.
Okay, thank you.
Sandra, we've lost Nancy.
No, I'm here.
Okay, sorry about that.
Am I here? Can you hear me?
We can hear you. Yes, you're back now. Thank you.
Okay. All right. So this giant portrait would be hanging in her Fifth Avenue home. And when people would come in, she would greet them in front of this portrait. So the way that these balls worked was she would send out an invitation saying the ball starts at 10 o'clock, be at my house at 10 o'clock. But the evening would start much earlier. The upper crust would have small dinner parties of like 6 to 8 people at their individual homes. And then, of course, they would get dressed in their finest dresses and their finest jewelry, and they would go to the opera, because there was always an opera held on the second Monday in January. Again, I don't know if they cared about the opera, but this was part of the ball routine. And they would go and they would stand in their opera boxes. They would keep the lights on in their opera boxes so everybody could see how beautifully dressed they were, and more importantly, what their jewelry looked like. And then they would leave the opera early, because remember, they had to be at Mrs. Astor's house by 10 o'clock. And when you're talking about 1,200 people, that is a long carriage line on Fifth Avenue waiting to get into Mrs. Astor's home. So then you would get into Mrs. Astor's home, you would greet her, you would go upstairs, and you would wait for everybody to get into the ballroom. And the ball actually started with these dances called quadrilles. And in this particular ball, she would have 4 quadrilles, and they were 4 couples that would come up with some type of costume and a dance. Like a hobby horse was a very popular one, where they would have horses' heads on their waist. And so there'd be 8, mainly debutante and young people would do these dances. It was very prestigious to be in a quadrille. And as a debutante, you wanted to be seen in these quadrilles. So remember that that's going to be important for later on, how important it was for these young people to participate in the quadrilles. Once the quadrilles were done, then the dancing would start. So from 11 to 12, it'd be general dancing. And then at 12 o'clock, you finally get to eat dinner, but it was called supper. So at midnight, they would serve a supper until 1. And then at 1 o'clock, they would have a cotillion. And because her ballroom was so large, she'd have to actually have 2 cotillions going at once, because cotillions are dances that are led by leaders. So she would have 2 leaders that would do these cotillions simultaneously. And again, if you were going to lead Mrs. Astor's cotillion, that was a very prestigious thing to do. Then the party would end at 3 o'clock. There was another supper served if you wanted to stay for it. The party would end between 3 and 3:30. And then, of course, we would all go to work the next day. Not really. So Ward McAllister remains active in society until about 1890, even though people are still mad at him. until 1890. He writes a book called Society as I Have Found It. And it's meant to be a memoir, an autobiography. And he wants to tell everybody how important he is in society and everything he knows and all the secrets he knows. And he publishes it. And so, of course, when he lifts up the veil of what is going on in society, he doesn't use names, but he uses enough details that everybody knows who he's talking about and what party he's talking about. And so as soon as he does this, upper crust turn their back on him. Even Mrs. Astor, she can't tolerate this because a lot of it's about her. Not that it's negative, but these are secrets, right? And the press just ridicules him mercilessly. And so unfortunately, Ward McAllister is going to just die alone and in disgrace. So these are two of the Astor homes that are in Newport. The one on the left is called Ballou, and this was Waldorf Astor's summer home. Today, they consider it a minor mansion in Newport. And when he and his family pick up and leave and go to Europe, the Vanderbilts buy this house and it becomes a Vanderbilt home. On the right is Beechwood, and that is William, so Caroline Astor's summer home. And that is also in private hands, and that is owned by Larry Ellison of Oracle. So both of these mansions are in private hands. This is just a map that shows you here's the new money mingling with the old money in Newport. And so originally you can see the little green Belmont Beach. That is where by the sea, the Belmont Mansion stood. And then if you come down to the middle of the screen, you see Beechwood. That's where the William Astor family held Beechwood stood. And then at the bottom is Ballou. That is where Waldorf Astor's family stood. So you can see originally it was Belmont Astor that were just in Newport with these mansions. Now here comes the new money. At the very top, you see the Breakers, and that was built by Cornelius Vanderbilt II. It's the largest mansion in Newport. It's 100,000 square feet. It's owned by the Preservation Society. It's open for tours. The next one is Rosecliff, which is another one of the blue circles. That was built by Tessie Ulrich, which we're talking about her. New money. That is also owned by the Preservation Society, open for tours. And then the last one is the Marble House, which is right below Beechwood. That is a Vanderbilt property built by William Vanderbilt. That is another Preservation Society property that's open for tour. So I told Kay, I just realized the other day, the new money is open for tours for by the Preservation Society, and the old money continues to be held in private hands. I thought that was just an interesting observation.
So
All right,
enter the nouveau riche women who are going to encroach upon Mrs. Astor's turf and eventually and cumulatively take over the society matron's crown. So let me introduce you to the triumvirate. On your left is Alva Smith Vanderbilt Belmont. In the middle is a lady that we will call Mamie. Her full name was Marion Anthon Fish. And the one on the right is a lady by the name of Teresa, whom we will call Tessie. And again, Mamie and Tessie were referred to by those names during the Gilded Age as well. And that's Tessie Fair Ulrich. My hands down favorite historical figure of the Gilded Age is Alva Vanderbilt Belmont. She was born in Mobile, Alabama. Alva's father was a wealthy cotton broker, and Alva's mother was the daughter of a U.S. congressman and had an uncle who was the governor of Kentucky. So she was raised in a very socially prominent Southern home. She was a spitfire in her youth. She was full of spit and vinegar, beating up any boy who dared to tease her and refusing to conform to the expectations that she be a good little girl, like most Southern girls of the era were raised to be. She would say later in life that she was only 4 years old when she first understood society's devaluation of women. Her older brother had died, and she overheard a family member remarking how much worse it was to lose a son than a daughter. And she knew then, and was introduced then, to the patriarchal social system she would spend the second half of her life rebelling against. Alva's family moved to Europe during the Civil War, but afterwards they will land in New York City when the family's fortunes were virtually depleted because of the war. Her father did continue to trade cotton, although at a much lesser scale, and her mother was forced to open and run a boarding house in the city. So by the time she enters her young adulthood, their social status is gone, most of their money is gone, yet she was still described as being a very bossy and demanding woman who challenged the social conventions of the day. So ironically, Alpha realizes that the only means for her to regain and advance her family's social status is going to have to be through an advantageous marriage. Luckily, her dearest friend was a Cuban heiress whose family socialized with none other than the Vanderbilts. So she is introduced to William K. Vanderbilt, you see here, that we call Willie K. Now, he is the grandson, or the third generation, as Nancy refers to it, of Commodore Vanderbilt himself. They meet at a party, and only a year to the day after the auspicious meeting, they get married. And in one fell swoop, Alva has restored her family's social position and financial status. So now she single-handedly starts taking on the old money establishment from the get-go. And she does so by building extravagant mansions to show off the Vanderbilt wealth. First, she builds a vacation home on Long Island. Then she creates the magnificent New York City mansion on Fifth Avenue that was substantially larger than Miss Caroline Astor's new Fifth Avenue mansion and far more ornate. So Alva's throwing down the gauntlet, and she's ready to catapult not only herself, but the rest of the Vanderbilt family on her shoulders into social acceptability. It was
Got what you
time
needed?
to hold a party. So Alva schedules her housewarming party, and it's called the Ephemeral Ball. And she schedules it for March of 1883, right after the house is completed, and she invites 1,200 guests. But in a stunningly calculated move, and remembering what Nancy said, if the Mrs. Astor had not left her calling card with Alva, Alva was under no obligation to invite the Astors. So she does not invite the Astors, and she knows full well that Mrs. Astor's daughter, Carrie, has her heart set on coming to the party of the year. Carrie has joined a quadrille group. They have been practicing for weeks and weeks, and now she can't go. So Mrs. Astor is really left with only one option. So what follows is a really bizarre and comical exchange, but Mrs. Astor gets into her carriage with her footman, travels down Fifth Avenue, and has the footman take her calling card into Alva. The next day, Alva gets in her carriage and goes up Fifth Avenue to Miss Astor's house and leaves her calling card with Miss Astor, which now gives Miss Astor Alva's permission to come and call on her, which is what Miss Astor does, and then succeeds in getting all the Astors invited to the party. But the most important thing was Alva won. So now every one of the Vanderbilt family was considered to have been arrived, and the social invitations will start flowing in. And Nancy and I wanted to show you pictures of the costumes as we talk about these balls. These were costumes that were worn at the ephemeral ball, and the ephemeral term is kind of a term for a fancy costume. So on the left, you see a lady by the name of Miss Henrietta Strong, and she was one of the quadrille dancers, and they danced the Dresden quadrille. And that whole group wore all white court costumes evoking the time of Frederick the Great. And it gave all of them a very eerie and intentional look of being porcelain dolls while they danced. In the center is Miss Kate Fearing Strong, who came in a cat ball gown, complete with an actual dead stuffed cat perched on her head as a headpiece, and she wore a gown whose overskirt was constructed by real white cat tails that were sewn onto a dark background. Yeah, I know, right? And Miss Edith Fish is who we see on the right, and I'm sorry the picture isn't that good, but Miss Edith Fish came dressed as the Duchess of Burgundy, and she had real sapphires, rubies, and emeralds sewn into the front of her dress, which you can kind of see them studded on her bodice in that picture. The most amazing costume of the evening was none other than the electric dress, and that was worn by Mrs. Cornelius Vanderbilt II. Her name was Alice. Alice carried a torch that actually lit up. Now remember, this is 1883, so but she has batteries sewn into the lining of her dress. that actually light the torch that she carried. And you can see the center picture, a picture of Alice, and then there's Cornelius Vanderbilt II in his garb for the affair as well. Now, this dress is currently on display at the Museum of the City of New York. In this picture, you can see what the dress looks like today on display, a full color image of it. It's beautiful, isn't it? So Alva's conquest of society was finally made complete by the attendance of none other than Tiny, Caroline Belmont, and her husband August. Now remember, their daughter had died and they had taken themselves out of society. So them reemerging it back into society in 1883 to attend Alva's ball was nothing short of a plum in Alva's cap as well. So Alva is going to continue building and buying, and what she does first is she completes the Marble House in 1892, and that's the mansion in Newport that they would occupy and spend their seasons in. She buys the world's largest yacht and names it after herself, largest private yacht. She names it the Alva, and she goes on to spend and show money and show money. But from the very beginning, her marriage to Willie Kay was really a mismatch. Alva was strong-willed, she was arrogant, ill-tempered, liberated, opinionated, all traits that intensified as the marriage progressed. Whereas Willie was considered to be very friendly, cultured, non-combative, and was said to be a very gentle and loving father to their 3 children. Alva would refer to Willie Kay as a weak non-entity. And she would also describe her marriage as legalized prostitution. So by 1894, the couple separate, as well they should have. And despite knowing that no woman of her social standing should dare consider such a thing, she files for divorce from Willie Kay on the grounds of adultery. And yes, he was adulterous, but women took it back then and to keep their social status. But they divorced the following spring in 1895. And she's immediately snubbed by the Vanderbilts. They want nothing more to do with her, and she loses her social standing. But Alva knows she has an ace in the hole, and that's her daughter Consuelo. And Consuelo was an absolute beauty. In fact, they say the Gibson girls are modeled after Consuelo Vanderbilt. So Consuelo was head over heels with a son of a Knickerbocker family by the name of Winthrop Rutherford. And she could not wait to be married to Rutherford. But Alva unilaterally decides her daughter's not going to marry Rutherford. I'm going to marry her off to the 9th Duke of Marlborough, and she's going to become a part of British royalty. So she actually places her daughter under house arrest. She places a guard at the door to Consuelo's room and threatens to shoot Rutherford if he comes anywhere near prior to this wedding to the Duke. So Alva's pawn is Consuelo. That's how she's going to regain her social status. Willie Kay, meek as he was, didn't do a thing about it, but he did pay the Duke a $10 million dowry for the marriage. So that's what it cost Willie Kay for his daughter to marry into royalty. What it cost Consuelo was 11 years of her life married to a man who despised her every bit as much as she despised him. But Alva was back in high standing, if only for the moment. In the following year of 1896, Alva declares that for the first time in her life, she has found true love, and she is going to marry. And she's going to marry none other than Oliver Hazard Belmont, Caroline's son. And coincidentally, Willie Kay's best friend. And as you can see, all this is getting kind of incestuous in the Newport, New York societies, right? Belmont had scandaled society years earlier when on his honeymoon with his one and only first wife, he took off with a French dancer. And so she immediately came back from the honeymoon to the United States and files for divorce and annulment. So basically, Oliver Hazard had just been a fun-loving bachelor for all the years in between. So as you might imagine, Alva had a lot of difficulty finding any clergy to marry the two of them. But Alva wasn't going to be dissuaded. She goes to the mayor of New York, and the mayor of New York is the one that performed their ceremony. So their ceremony and their marriage caused a great sensation in Gilded Age society. And it was considered a huge scandal because of both of them had been divorced. So newspapers nationwide start picking up on the story. And as you can see, it is covering newspapers with articles about the couple. When they get back from their honeymoon in Europe, now they're not only shunned by the Vanderbilts, but the Belmonts shun them because they're living in their vast mansions on Alva's Vanderbilt money, and that's what's supporting the couple. But like I said, Alva was intent on continuing to be a queen of society, so she continues to throw lavish parties, reminding people she is the mother of a duchess, and she regains her social status. It is said that during Alva's truly happy marriage to Oliver Belmont, and they were truly happy, they were a good match to one another, she transformed into a friendlier and kinder person. She would later testify at her daughter's divorce and annulment proceedings that she was the one that had forced Consuelo into the unwanted marriage, and she was to blame for her daughter's unhappiness. But after 12 years of this wonderful marriage, Oliver dies very unexpectedly from a burst in appendicitis, and he's only 50 years old at the time of his death. And this happens in 1908. And Alva was absolutely devastated. But she was also now wealthier than you could even imagine, because not only did she still have her Vanderbilt money, the Vanderbilt mansions, and the alimony that Willie K continued to generously give her, she also had the Belmont fortune and the Belmont mansions and millions and millions and millions of dollars. So rather than to step back into society and become the leader again, she actually unleashes all of her inexhaustible energy into philanthropic and political activities, most especially the women's suffrage movement. She builds the Belmont Hospital in Hempstead, New York on Long Island. And again, for the time, this is quite unusual because she staffs the entire hospital with women doctors, women nurses, women professionals. It was all run and operated by women. Then she rebuilds a church. She then opens an agricultural school for women. And then, to the utter horror of the society women over whom she had once reigned supreme, she very willingly and intentionally steps off the mountain and diverts all of her remaining attention to the women's suffrage movement. Alva buys a mansion near near Washington, D.C., and it will become the National Women's Party headquarters. And it's still open to the public today as the Sewell Belmont Museum in Washington, D.C. So check it out if you're ever there. She would serve as that party's president until her death. She then opens up her New York and Newport mansions to numerous suffragette rallies. And if you go to visit Marble House today, almost the entire bottom floor is dedicated to all the different suffrage activities that she had. She became a major supporter, a campaigner, a speaker, a writer for the movement. And she even led parades down in Manhattan and paid for the party leaders to travel nationwide to spread the word and to encourage more membership. She will lead the active role in support of women until her death. And as she said it herself best, I have blazed a trail for the rest to walk in. Nancy, tell us about Tessie.
Kind of hard to follow Alva Vanderbilt, but okay. This is Teresa Tessie Fair Ulrich. And if you were with us in the fall and you were part of the Robber Baron series, you'll recognize this man, her father, James Graham Fair. She was a daughter of Mr. Fair, and Mr. Fair immigrated from Ireland when he was a young man to come to the gold rush. So he went to California to find his fortune. He wasn't successful in the gold mine, so he moves to Virginia City and switches to silver, where he and his partners discover the largest silver mine veins ever, and he becomes a millionaire overnight. So he takes his family now. Meanwhile, Tessie has been born in Virginia City in the mining camps. He takes his children and his wife and he moves back to San Francisco, where they are the leaders of society. Tessie's very popular, very pretty, very athletic, but Mr. Fair's not that great of a husband. He's a drinker or a drunk, and he's also a womanizer. And so after suffering for many years with Mr. Fair, his wife decides to divorce him. And this was really unusual because James Fair is one of the few robber barons that we talked about who is Catholic. It was very unusual for the Irish and the Catholic to be successful. And so she gets a divorce, which is unusual for Catholics, but it's also unusual, as Kay said, for women of that standing to get a divorce. But she actually gets a settlement of $5 million. So she doesn't miss him much. Anyway, she takes her daughter to Newport, and her daughter is playing tennis at the casino in Newport. And she meets a man by the name of Herman Ulrich, who is also very athletic. So the two of them have a lot in common. He's 20 years older than her, but they fall in love. Now, Herman Ulrich is one of the 400, right? So he's first generation American, he's German descent. And he lives in New York City, where his family got their money from the shipping industry. So they go back to California to get married. And I thought it was interesting to show you the invitation, because the invitation is just from her mother, Mrs. Teresa Fair. Her father is not mentioned at all. And because she's Catholic and Mr. Ulrich is not Catholic, he's probably Protestant as a German, they can't get married in the Catholic Church. So they end up getting married in her home. And her father's not invited, but he's a pretty good sport. He gives her $1 million as a wedding gift. So Herman takes his new wife, they go back to New York, and he introduces her to New York society. But Tessie wants to conquer Newport society. Now, here's a couple pictures of Tessie during her lifetime. Now, unlike Alva, Tessie was not concerned with charities, and she wasn't really philanthropic. But on the bottom left, that's a picture of her with her son, Herman Jr., in 1915, where she has a fashion show. But that's about as charitable as Tessie gets. It was said of Tessie that her business is invitations, calling cards, dinners, balls, gowns, and jewelry. So she's immersed in the society of being at the top of one of the grand dames of society. Now, in order to conquer Newport, that's a little more challenging than conquering New York City, because of course it's a much smaller town where the old guard have already, as I showed you, have already kind of planted themselves on the cliff walk. So she does two things. The first thing is she builds this beautiful mansion here on the bottom right. It's called Rosecliff. You might recognize it because it was where The Great Gatsby with Robert Redford was filmed, maybe the movie 27 Dresses. It is owned by the Preservation Society. And this mansion is one of the few mansions that you can actually have a wedding in. You can rent out the ballroom. And so my son's getting married in a year. And I said, hey, Jackson, why don't you get married at Rosecliff? And he said, that's gross, Mom. And then I found out how much it was. And I went, that's gross. Yes, very good. Anyway, if you're interested in renting out Rosecliff, bring your checkbook. So she builds a beautiful mansion, and then she also teams up with this man named Harry Lear. Now, I think Nathan Lane would be a perfect Harry Lear, but he is a very interesting character. So when McAllister is shunned from society, there's this void. And so Harry Lear's like this bon vivant, right? He's flamboyant, he's funny, he's silly, he can sing, he can dance, he tells story, he's very entertaining. This is a picture of him in the middle with his wife. To the left is Harry dressed up in drag, foreshadowing there. And he is in actually a theater play here. But he is makes this burst on the scene in New York City. And he has all of these ideas how to entertain. And so at first, Mrs. Astor hires him as her social secretary. But Harry is not really into regular balls and traditional entertainment. He wants to show off his, flamboyant side and share his great ideas. So he doesn't have his own money. Again, he's a secretary. He's not wealthy. He doesn't have a mansion. He doesn't have a place to give balls or the money to fund one. So he decides, kind of like Alva, the way to success is through marrying somebody wealthy. So he meets this woman by the name of Elizabeth Drexel. Bessie Drexel, she comes from the Drexel banking family. So she has a lot of money, and he courts her and they end up getting married. But on the first night, on their wedding night, after they've been married, she's in the hotel that they're staying at, and she has this dinner set in her boudoir, and she expects him to come and have dinner with her. But instead of Mr. Lear showing up, a maid shows up, and she says, Mr. Lear is not going to be joining you. He's in his own, he's going to have dinner in his own room. And so at first, Mrs. Lear thinks he must be sick. And so she goes to his room and says, Harry, what's going on? Do you not feel well? And we know what he says because she writes a book later on about this, but can anybody guess what he says? He says, I don't love you. I find you repulsive. I'll be nice to you in public, but I don't want to spend 1 minute with you unless it's necessary. Women repulse me. So Harry Lear is gay. She does not say that in her book. You have to read between the lines, or you have to read the articles about Harry Lear. And with 21st century eyes, lenses, we know that Harry Lear was gay, especially when he says he finds he finds all women to be repulsive. And so, of course, she's devastated that her husband, that she thought loved her and she loves him, wants nothing to do with her. He says, I'll be nice with you in public and I'll stay married to you as long as you fund our marriage, and I will introduce you to society and I will make you a society queen. And so she decides ultimately to remain married to Harry Lear, and they're married until his death. And so they have an arrangement. And he has all these great ideas. Some of them are better than others. These are two of his kind of bad ideas. He decides he's going to have a dog party, a birthday party for dogs. He invites 100 of the society women to bring their dogs for Bog's birthday party. Now, only 30 of the women show up with their dogs, but the dogs are eating, what's the expensive meat, Kay?
Veal.
Veal, yeah. The dogs are eating veal and very expensive cuts of meat. Now, remember, one of the things that's unique about the that we know about the Gilded Age is extreme wealth, right? And so the newspaper reporters who hate the upper crust anyway, they print all these articles about how Harry Lear and his wife have a dog party, feeding them veal when the rest of the, when there's all these people starving and can't even afford to eat meat. So he was this was a very unpopular, unsuccessful party. Then he decides he's going to dress up a chimpanzee and call him a prince and feed the chimpanzee alcohol. Another not a good idea with our 21st century eyes. We know what happens there. So this monkey, of course, gets drunk. He's swinging from the chandelier, throwing champagne glasses at people. So Harry doesn't get off to a good start, but he eventually fits his groove, and he becomes one of the people that's going to help Mamie, Tessie, and Alva dominate society with these creative parties. So I just want to share with you two of Tessie's most popular parties. Here's her beautiful ballroom that you can rent. They just renovated that ballroom because, as you can see, that's her backyard. It's right on the ocean. So even though these are mansions and they're made out of granite or stone, the salt water does a number on these mansions. This was a bal blanc party that she had. So it's an all white party. So everything was white. The flowers, they had white swans in the ponds here, in the fountains. Everybody wore white except the men. They were supposed to wear white breeches and either light pink jackets or blue jackets. She wanted the backyard there to look like it was a harbor. So the Newport, the Navy had been in Newport for a long time. She goes down to the Navy and she says, I want you to park your boats, your ships in front of my house so that people will think it's a harbor. And the Navy says, forget about that. And so she ends up building these beautiful fake, wooden boats and parks them outside of her house here. So it looks like it is a harbor, and 300 people come. It cost her $20,000. And it made the newspapers across the country, and that was one of her more successful parties. The second party is really a kid's party. It was for her son, Herman Ulrich. When he's about 7 years old, she decides she's going to have a circus for him at Rosecliff. And of course, kids can't come by themselves, so it turns into a kid and an adult party. But she puts up this giant circus tent, and she tells the world that Harry Lear is going to be the ringmaster. And then uncharacteristic of Harry Lear, he chickens out at the last minute. So he's not the ringmaster, but forever, he's going to be known as this ringmaster because it was told he was going to. And they have animals that are actually, can you go back to that were actually people dressed up as animals. They weren't real animals. She had sideshows. She had pink lemonade, peanuts, popcorn. It was a very successful circus party on, and then at night turns into a big party for the adults. Okay. So as you can imagine, being a society leader is not all fun and games, and especially when you have 3 women that have teamed up to lead society. Now, they did not call themselves the Triumvirate. That is what she was called. They were called by the papers during that period. That was their, their name. But they called themselves the leader of the social board. And so what these 3 people, Mamie, Alva, and Tessie would do is they would get together in the beginning of the season, say in Newport, and they would set the social calendar. And so they would say who could have a party on Saturday night, who would have it on Monday, who would have it on Friday. Of course, you didn't want to have your party on a Friday because by that time the guests are kind of burned out and they probably won't come. So you want to make sure that the parties are spread out. They would also talk about who was going to be the guest of honor. And as you can imagine, it didn't always go well. And they would come into little tiffs. And so apparently this one summer, Tessie and Alva got into a dispute either over a party or when it was held or who was going to be the guest of honor. It's not recorded what their tiff was about. But Tessie was devastated because remember, Tessie's life is all about entertaining. Alva, who maybe she didn't care, but society shut down that summer in Newport because nobody wanted to go to Alva's party because it's the same 400 people, remember, because then Tessie would be mad at them. And you don't want to go to Tessie's party because God forbid Alva be mad at you. And so there really was very little entertainment this summer while these 2 of the Triumvirate were fighting. And then the next year, it looks like it's going to be Tessie and Mamie that are going to get into a dispute. And thank goodness, Harry Lear steps up, and whatever their differences were, he was able to negotiate a peace. But this just tells you what Tessie was made of. She was very, what's the word? She was very, not weak, but she was very, she cared about this a lot. All right, so Tessie's married to Herman. They both live in New York, but Tessie's life really is in San Francisco. Tessie's father, who again is a multimillionaire, he dies in San Francisco, and his estate is challenged. Remember I told you he was a womanizer? Well, apparently there's 5 or 6 women that think they were married to him. So they file they challenge his estate. Then her brother dies, and she's one of the heirs in his will. That estate is also challenged. And then she wants to build some type of monument to her father. So she decides she wants to create the Fairmont hotels. I don't know if you guys have ever heard of the Fairmont hotels, but they're very luxurious hotels. And Tessie's maiden name is Fair. So she says to her husband, Herman, I want you to go to California and represent my interest. I want you to build this hotel. I don't want you to settle my estate and manage my money. In exchange for him going there, she gives him power of attorney. And in exchange, he gives her a will, a copy of his will, where he leaves everything to Tessie and her son, their son. Well, they've been separated for a while now. This was about 1903. Something happens. She's either not happy with how he's handling the estate or building the hotels, but they become estranged. And they don't see each other for several years. It said the son didn't see his father for 7 years. And so Tessie's on the Newport side and he's on the California side in San Francisco. And then in 1906, of course, is the great earthquake of San Francisco. And she's afraid that Herman has been killed in the earthquake because the news on the East Coast is that San Francisco has just been decimated. And so while she's waiting to hear that he's okay, she realizes she really does love him and she wants to make up with him. So she sends him a message, come to Newport. I'm going to have a special dinner for us and we're going to work this out. So he comes to the East Coast, but he doesn't go to Newport. He goes to New York. He gets on a ship and he goes to Europe. He gets to Europe, he gets ill, he gets back on the ship, and he's on his way home, he dies on the ship. When he lands in New York, Tessie's told that Herman has died, and also his brother, who lives in Newport, has a surprise for Tessie. Herman has made a new will dated 1906. And in his new will, he has completely disinherited Tessie and her son. Now, the reason he gives for that is that Tessie's a multimillionaire in her own right, doesn't need his money, and that he knows that she will take care of their son. But Tessie's problem or issue with the will, because that's all true, she doesn't dispute that. Tessie's issue with the will is, where did Herman Ulrich's money come from? It came from handling Tessie's estate in California. That's where a lot of his wealth. So in essence, what Herman was doing was giving Tessie's money to his brother. And that's why she objects. So she takes her 1903 copy of the will and she runs to San Francisco, California. And her brother files the probate in Rhode Island. Why does Tessie go to California?
Right now. Go
What's
ahead,
in
Nancy.
California? She wants the probate court in California to hear her will because it's a community property state. He cannot disinherit her. She's entitled to 50% of his estate. In Rhode Island, women, we're not treated that great, even today in the will dispute. But she goes to California and she wins and she gets half of his estate. So ultimately, even though she doesn't need the money, she prevails in this battle of the wills. And she lives until 1926. In 1924, she gets ill and she's bedridden in New York City. And so her doctor says in 1926, let's take her to Newport. It's quieter, it's calmer, and let's get her out of New York City. So he takes her to Newport to Rosecliff, and they put her in a padded room with bars on the window. And why did they do that? Because they were convinced that Tessie was insane and that she had lost her mind. And so all of the papers, when they announced her death, was that she lost her mind, that she had gone crazy, which didn't sound right to me because she was only 55, because I'm thinking, well, maybe she had Alzheimer's, you know. So because she died in Newport, I was able to find her death certificate. And she died from a disease called Addison's disease. I don't know if anybody's ever heard of that or not, but it's a disease of the adrenal glands. And one of the symptoms from this particular disease, not always, but sometimes, is a psychiatric symptoms like auditory, delusional, or you hear voices. So unfortunately, she dies in her, and everybody thinks she dies from being crazy, which, you know, is kind of sad. She does not get buried with her husband. She's buried in the same cemetery. He's buried with his family, and she's buried here. And then when her son dies, he is also buried with her. And the next one is just a reminder. Oops, what happened to the daughter?
I'm sorry.
Oh, did you take it out?
No. Unless you put-
Well, anyway, her younger sister ends up, her name's Birdie, and she ends up marrying Willie Vanderbilt Jr. So you can see, again, the incestuous nature of it. Her 15 years younger sister, Birdie, is going to marry into the Vanderbilt family. And so, again, it's all commingling in society.
So our third lady in the Triumvirate is second only to Alva, in my opinion, and maybe perhaps Harry Lear, in terms of being a colorful character of the Gilded Age. Mamie was an irreverent woman with a quick wit and a sharp and biting tongue, and with something that was described as a horse laugh, which I myself can relate to. Mamie was born in Richmond County, New York, on Staten Island, and she was the daughter of a prominent attorney whose lineage traced back to the Knickerbockers. So she was born with old money pedigree. And though she had a wealthy upbringing, she had a very rudimentary education, to be honest. She would often say later in life that she could barely read or write, although in truth, she was quite intelligent in spite of her self-professed illiteracy. She marries her childhood sweetheart, a gentleman by the name of Stuyvesant Fish, and he was of like pedigree. He was the son of Hamilton Fish, and for those of you that know your history, he was the governor of New York, U.S. Senator, and served as the U.S. Secretary of State under President Grant. Stuyvesant will go on to become a president of the Illinois Central Railroad. So then his old pedigree mixes with the new money source of income. And the couple enjoys considerable wealth. Mamie would casually refer to it as only a few $1 million. But the couple had a very successful and loving marriage as well. So it is said that no New York or Newport hostess was more outrageous than Mamie Fish. With her penchant for inventiveness and reverie, she was dedicating herself to ushering out the old formal, stiff, and boring parties of the old guard, like Mrs. Astor threw. Even though she was a product of old money, she started embracing and expanding the social circle by bringing in new money folks who she herself found more interesting. Always looking for new and inventive ways to entertain, her numerous parties and social events were so successful that the journalist Cleveland Armory rightfully declared that more people had more fun on more occasions in Mamie Fish's house than anywhere else. Mamie's house in Newport was the Crossways estate, which you see here on your left, and it was located on Ocean Drive. Nancy tells me it is now converted into condos, but it still stands today, and you can drive by it. Her New York City home on the right is also still standing and was said to boast one of the biggest ballrooms in New York, and it is currently owned by former New York Mayor Michael Bloomberg. So she was known as the sauciest society host. And Mamie was also known, as I said, for a biting tongue and caustic wit, often insulting people at the expense of her well-heeled guests. And because of her impeccable lineage, she got away with it. It was said that you were not a proper member of society unless you had been on the receiving end of one of Mamie Fish's barbs. She would say to greet guests when they entered her home, "Make yourself at home," before adding, "No one wishes you were there more than I." She would also receive her guests by saying, "I don't remember inviting you." And she was once confronted by Alva. Alva goes to Mamie and says, "I hear you're telling people I look like a frog." "Oh, not a frog," Mamie replied. "A toad, my pet, a toad." So once there was another story about a gentleman confronting her because he was annoyed at being left out of all her famous parties. And so trying to get the upper hand, he says to her, "I can never quite remember the name of your house, Mrs. Fish. Isn't it Cross Patch?" To which Mamie responded, "Young man, it's a patch you'll never cross." So you can imagine this kind of rule breaker with loose tongue and sharp tongue who defied convention. She was a favorite topic of newspapers in New York and Newport, and her guests adored her. Of the many balls that she held at Crossways was her infamous fairy tale ball. As you can see here in the upper left-hand corner, you see this huge Mother Goose book. That was where the guests made their entrance into the ballroom through that book. And she herself presided as queen of the fairies and had two small girls dressed as fairies carrying her train as she promenaded throughout the ball. And the next one, she was not one to ever not continue to outdo herself. And who did she team up with in that regard? Mr. Harry Lear. So as the two joined forces to rebel against social expectation and were beginning to rewrite the rules, one time she throws a party to honor the Grand Duke Boris of Russia, who you see in the lower left-hand corner there. And he happened to be a guest in Newport that particular summer at the home of a woman by the name of Mrs. Ogden Gilded. When Mrs. Goulet discovers that Mamie had intentionally left one of her house guests off the invitation list, she goes to Mamie and says, "Well, you left my house guest off the list." Mamie said, I wasn't going to invite him. And so she said, "Well, if he can't come, I'm not coming, and no one in my house is coming, and neither is the Grand Duke Boris of Russia coming to your party." So she was left without her guest of honor, but she's deciding she's going to go on. And she puts the word out that someone better than the Duke has arrived at her house. She was able to find someone better, and that's the Grand Tsar of Russia. And he would be attending her ball. So when the ball takes place, they're all seated and they're anxiously awaiting the arrival of the Tsar. She announces him, and out comes Harry Lear, dressed up in an elaborate costume, holding a royal specter, and it delighted the entire crowd. Now, Mamie's Colonial Ball is another ball that she's very famous for, where she would have her guests dress in colonial fashions, She would transform her house, which was already of a colonial style, as we saw in the picture. She would transform it back to the colonial days of Newport by having cherry trees planted, American flags, trophies. Her servants would be dressed up in powdered wigs and navy and gold uniforms. And it is said that one particular ball cost her almost $500,000 in today's money. She was also given the distinct honor of having the closing ball of every season in Newport, and that was called the Harvest Ball, where she would transfer the house into a farm. So we know she was biting. We know she said a lot of nasty things to a lot of people, but it wasn't until she died of a sudden brain aneurysm just shy of her 62nd birthday, and this was in 1915, that people started finding out how extraordinarily charitable she was. It turns out her servants loved her. She got along with everybody in her house. On the days that she didn't have social events, she could be found in the kitchen playing cards with the cooks. She anonymously supported starving artists. She was a driving force behind raising money for the Red Cross and the Salvation Army. And she was said to give so liberally to so many charitable causes they couldn't count it. And her best epitaph was what was said later when they said, perhaps no woman did more for Newport than Mamie Fish, and not certainly as colorful. So Nancy?
So we kind of forgot about Mrs. Astor there for a minute, but just know that while these three triumvirates were entertaining, Mrs. Astor is also entertaining. And that's why we had the picture of the four, because there's a triumvirate, but Mrs. Astor remains to be the dominant society leader. And she dies in 1908. She falls down her stairs in her New York house in 1905, and she's never the same. And they say she has, well, periodic dementia, but don't we all? And she dies. She dies in 1908, and that was when she's 82 years old, and at that time she was still, known as the head of the society crowd. So those are the grand dames that we wanted to share with you. There's no way we could tell you. There's probably 10 or 15 more that we'd love to share with you, but these are
minor players, yeah,
these are the ones you're going to see in the Gilded Age HBO.
Right. You will see all of those characters, if not more. Thank you. Does anybody have any questions? Hey, thanks. Is there, yes.
If you have a theme series that you didn't know all about, it was the, why, of the new money, was that Alva?
Alva was, I guess in some extent, Nancy, Tessie was considered new money.
Yep, Tessie was new
not
money.
Yeah,
Yep.
because it wasn't a 3-generational thing.
Okay.
Alva was, maybe Fish wasn't so much because she had the pedigree, but when then her husband goes into railroading and it kind of gets, she's sort of the blend of both new and old money.
So this may be that if, it's taken this and melded more than one person together, if he loves her, but if you describe someone that she didn't really,
Alva didn't like Willie Case so much. That was her first husband, the Vanderbilt, but she adored Oliver Husband Belmont. I mean, they had what was said to be a very, very strong marriage.
I just want to add about Oliver Hazard Belmont. Not only did he leave his wife on their honeymoon, but she was pregnant at the time. And when she comes back, she won't let him have anything to do with the baby. So he says it's not his baby, but she's adopted by his ex-wife's husband, and she becomes one of the society leaders too, but he never acknowledges her.
So I did, in preparation for this, I actually listened to an interview, a podcast with one of the actresses who plays Mamie Fish in the series. And you see her, according to this podcast, on the very first episode of the first season. And I made the mistake of listening to her talk about, what elements of Mamie's personality she was trying to draw in and match it up. But fortunately, with her on this podcast was a historian who would correct her when, say, no, this is the more accurate statement. But she did a tremendous amount of research before she took on the role. And she talked about, researching it for a long period of time.
And I guess you guys have I know you figured out that Bertha is Alva in the Gilded Age.
Yes, ma'am.
Is this all in a written book form Where?
Well, our presentation, no.
Yeah.
No, it's
All
Nancy,
ladies.
yeah, it's Nancy and I. Now, Nancy, is there one particular book that you can point to that's a good reference for the Gilded Age women?
Yeah,
Which
well, I will tell you that if you can find a copy of King Lear, Hellehr, which is the book written by Harry's widow, she tells it all. It's a
She
great book.
spills the beans, yeah, she
Yeah.
does. She
It was
does.
written in 1935, so you know, it might be out of print. But if you could find, and it also has great pictures of the various society women. And again, it actually has a picture of Harry Lear's alleged paramour.
Right, and supposedly he had a ongoing affair with this man for over 2 decades, right?
What was the name of King Lear?
King Lear, Lehr. But in answer to your question, I don't know one particular volume that would cover all of it, but I honestly haven't looked. 'Cause
Well,
we
and
do
the
most
problem is
research from our-
a lot of them are written by descendants of one of the grand dames, so that it's kind of got to, you know, I heard that Anderson Cooper book is good, the Astor book.
Yeah, yeah, he does a really good job with the Vanderbilt book.
Astors, the Astors.
Well, he also wrote one about his Vanderbilt
Yeah.
ancestry. too. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Nancy just, I think it was Nancy, just mentioned the woman whose husband wouldn't recognize the child. So
Yep.
she was pregnant when they got married.
It was, yeah, Oliver
No.
Hazard Belmont's first wife.
She
Were
got
they
pregnant, she got
on the
pregnant
honeymoon?
she got pregnant on the honeymoon. But what happened was he takes her to Europe on their honeymoon, and then she brings her mother and her sisters. And he wants some privacy on his honeymoon with his wife. So he asks her, can you get rid of your mom and your sisters? And she says no. And so one of Oliver's problems at the time was he liked to drink, and he gets drunk. And like Kay said, he leaves. He falls in with this French chorus girl. Meanwhile, his wife goes back to Newport, and then she discovers that she's pregnant with his child, but she doesn't want anything to do with him. And then he says, well, then that's probably not my child then, but it was.
Anything else? Well, thank you again. Oh, and next month, we are highlighting in April for our April class, a story that Nancy and I did and was published last year in 2023 that actually at the end of the year got an award for being one of the top editor picks for 2023. And it's called I Could Have Shot Him.
Killed
I
him.
could have killed him twice. And it's about a young woman, a young African-American woman who lived in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and an entire social movement that kind of springs up around her. So we hope you'll join us for that as well.
Well, thank you very much.
Thanks.
Really appreciate it. And don't forget your course evaluation.